I want to talk about the chief turning point, I used to call it, in my life. What I learnt then, what I unlearnt, and if that event hadn't happened, that moment, that morning, if I hadn't had a certain book by a certain author, if I hadn't been sure somehow that that book contained something which, if I understood, would change my life and enable me to continue. Because I was about 23, in my early 20s, and I needed to change. Something needed to happen. I was on a path that was unsustainable. I couldn't continue on it because I'd run out of fuel, or the path had reached the edge of a cliff or a brick wall, or it wouldn't go any further. I couldn't go any further. And I was looking for something. I was searching. I had been searching for how to live, something that would tell me how to live. And I was alive. Why should I want to know how to live? Because I had been traumatized, I suppose you could say. I had learnt wrong stuff. I was afraid. I was in despair. I had been through school. I had been brought up. I'd been through university. I had survived about a month in my first job. Come to grief after about one day before even beginning work in my second job. And I'd got myself a job where it wasn't too stressful. I didn't have to work too hard. I didn't get paid very much either. As a library assistant in a public library in London. I got a bedsit. I was living on my own. I'd learned how to cook simple meals for myself. go shopping for simple things, easy things. I taught myself those things. About the only useful thing I'd learnt at home was how to wash up, not how to cook, not housework, not how to look after myself. All that I learnt alone, myself, which was fine. It was good that I did that. But one thing I couldn't do was not be afraid, I couldn't be at ease. And it was getting worse. I was having these bouts of fighting down some frightful feeling, which I suppose was a combination of fear and depression, madness, a strong feeling which I couldn't stand. And my search for a solution to my problem, how to live, had led me to a book by Krishnamurti. Well, it had led me to Krishnamurti via Henry Miller, the books in my life. And there I was. And that had a chapter on Krishnamurti, good old Henry Miller. And Henry Miller, reading some of his famous books, I think I definitely read Tropic of Cancer, maybe one of his other books by that time. And he had a way of living in the moment, I suppose, which was viable. I mean, he knew what suffering was, what anxiety was. And I thought, it gave me the idea it must be possible to get out from under what had been heaped on me by way of, I don't know, whatever it was I'd been through. I didn't even remember the worst of it then. But the effect of the worst of it was with me. I could say so much about that. What happened to me? What I knew had happened to me at that stage. A kind of loneliness. A cynicism. A hopelessness. Anyway, here I was with this book, and having read about Krishnamurti in Henry Miller's The Books in My Life, it gave me hope. What it made, there were quotations in there. There's quite a big chapter on Krishnamurti in that book. And Krishnamurti hadn't been profoundly changed by his encounter with Krishnamurti. He'd just recognized in Krishnamurti wisdom, life. He had seen life, wisdom. He'd seen it. He'd seen it there. He'd recognised it there. He'd detected it there. And he went on about it in this chapter. Enthused, admiration, astonishment, a kind of humility he felt. He went to hear him talk. I can't remember where that was, probably in Washington, D.C. Krishnamurti travelled and spoke during his life to various places in America. Including Washington, D.C. I don't know about New York, which is, I know where Henry Miller was for a while. Anyway, the first time I actually picked up a book by Krishnamurti, which was quite near the house I lived in London, the Bedsit, in the Finchley Road this bookshop was. I thought I'd go there to see if there were any books by Krishnamurti, and so I toddled off down the road, which is quite near. This road was just led past where I worked in the public library there, Swiss Cottage Library. And I knew there was a bookshop up this road, a few hundred yards, so I walked up and went into the shop. And there was a table quite near the door. And it was loaded with books by Krishnamurti. It was an astonishing sight. I think the proprietor of the shop must have got into Krishnamurti and impressed by him and ordered a load of books, thought it might sell. At that time, Krishnamurti was sort of, he never was very famous or very popular, but there were times when he was, I mean, these books were published by Gollancz, who is a mainstream, respectable publisher. And there were several copies of each book, and it was crammed on this table. Anyway, I picked one up, and I opened it. And the moment my eye rested on the page, before it even had really completed a sequence of sentences and begun to even get the first inkling of what Krishnamurti was really saying, apart from what I'd read in the Krishnamurti in Henry Miller's book. Just something about that page, the way the words were put together and how my eye responded to it and brain. I knew that I'd found what I was looking for. I knew that the answer to my problems was in this book. Now that is a mystery. How it was that I'd never seen that. I mean, I'd seen it I suppose it was a two-stage process. There was Henry Miller, a more ordinary sort of bloke, and embedded in his words was a description of Krishnamurti plus some quotes. So I suppose I owe a lot to Henry Miller's recognition of the wisdom of Krishnamurti. Henry Miller was an intelligent man in many ways. He was not stupid, and he was sufficiently undamaged and unprejudiced and untwisted in his mind to see. He was sufficiently simple. He had enough of his mind clear for Krishnamurti and what Krishnamurti said to have this impact on him. He communicated that in his book, and that reached me, and that predisposed me, perhaps, to recognize what I was looking for. But I'd been looking for an answer to my problems for a while, and it was an interesting process. It always interests me when you look for something. You really, I mean, usually it's something you've lost, so you know what the hell it is and what it looks like. But I was looking for something I hadn't seen before. But I'd sort of, as I said, I'd seen it in stages. I mean, I had seen this chapter in Krishnamurti's book, so it wasn't so mysterious. But even so, that page, seeing a whole page in a whole book by Krishnamurti, the feel of that, physically almost, was quietly an extraordinary moment when that happened. And yet, yes, extraordinary. I bought the book, but it was a while before I began to understand it. I raved about it. I talked to everybody. I became a bit of a Krishnamurti bore. I said, this man, he's got the answer. This will change the world if people get this. But I didn't get it. I was still in a bad way. It didn't change me. I wasn't cured, or I hadn't started off on a road of recovery from my huge problems. It was a mental health problem. I didn't call it that then, but that's what it was. It's what we now call a mental health problem. And the turning point had not yet occurred. And I think I've probably said enough about how I approached, how I got to there, how I got to that turning point. I've said something about it. I've said enough for this present little spontaneous ramble. And in my next spontaneous ramble, I will begin by talking about the day when I spent a whole morning when I should have been at work. I phoned in sick and I stayed in bed, and I knew the answer was in this book. And I thought, I am going to sit here with this book until I've understood.